Eleanor's name flashed on his smartwatch 19 times. 19. Each one was a panic-laced notification from their home security system as a violent, unforeseen complication threatened their unborn son. He saw every single alert. He read each automated, desperate transcript of her voice. Then, with a flick of his thumb, he enabled theater mode, silencing the world, pulled the woman beside him closer, and went back to sleep. The last coherent thought she had before the pain overwhelmed her was Julian. But Julian was busy. What came next, however, is a tale of astonishing strength. The betrayed wife he left to bleed alone was no delicate socialite. She was a former investigative journalist, and her father was one of the most respected federal judges on the East Coast. So when the full scope of his betrayal came to light, she didn't break down. She started building a case. This is the story of how a mother's fierce, protective drive, born in the ashes of a devastating betrayal, systematically dismantled a corrupt artificial intelligence empire from the inside out. And you will be captivated by every single moment. So pay attention. This tale uncovers a vital truth. Deception might shatter your world, but it never has to be your final story. Eleanor lost her baby, her husband, and almost her own life. But she refused to be defined as a victim. She channeled her grief into a flawless strategy, her agony into ambition, and her unbearable loss into a foundation that would one day rescue thousands of other women. The lesson is as simple as it is powerful. Your circumstances do not get the last say on your strength. It is only when you have nothing left to lose that you discover who you were truly meant to become. True justice isn't about getting even. It's about ensuring those who inflict pain can never harm anyone again. Several months before her final move, a bitter wind swept in from the Boston harbor and through the ancient trees of the Mount Auburn Cemetery. It cut through the expensive wool coats of the mourners, a cold that felt like it settled in your bones. Standing slightly apart from the small crowd was Eleanor Vance. Her face was a perfect, stoic mask of sorrow, her posture as rigid as the granite angels surrounding her. She wore a simple, brutally expensive black dress, her blonde hair pulled into a tight, severe knot. To any casual observer, she was the image of dignified mourning, but beneath that polished surface, an emotion far more potent and dangerous than grief was simmering. The pastor's voice was a dull drone in the background. He spoke of empty platitudes, like eternal rest and a better place. Eleanor had dismissed those fairy tales 3 months ago, on the night she lost her child. It was the same night her husband silenced her cries for help to sleep with his mistress. Now, standing at the memorial service she had orchestrated, Eleanor felt the faintest hint of a smile touch her lips. It wasn't a smile of happiness, but of cold, calculated victory, a strategy executed to perfection. She recalled the mantra she'd repeated in the darkness of her empty home. They say grief makes you reckless, but grief wasn't my fuel. Betrayal was. And the people who destroyed my son's future learned a very important lesson. My father taught me how the law works, and I never, ever lose. As the service concluded, her eyes scanned the grounds, not looking for anyone, because she knew exactly where the two people who mattered were. They were hundreds of miles away, trading designer clothes for government-issue orange jumpsuits. Julian Croft had been sentenced to 20 years. Katerina Novak had received 35. But to comprehend how Eleanor went from a heartbroken mother-to-be to an instrument of meticulous justice, we must go back to the beginning. We have to return to a morning that began like any other, in a life that looked perfect on the outside, but was rotting from the inside. 3 months earlier, the day dawned gray and damp over Beacon Hill. Eleanor moved through her enormous, custom-designed kitchen. A deep exhaustion settled in her bones, but she pushed it aside, her entire world narrowed to the child she carried. She sat at the marble island, a high-tech wellness monitor strapped around her pregnant belly, its soft, rhythmic pulse a constant comfort. It was a steady beat, a tiny, precious life growing within her. She placed a bowl of organic blueberries and yogurt in front of her, trying to force a smile to mask the anxiety coiling in her gut. "Breakfast time, little one," she whispered to her bump. Just then, the sharp, confident clicks of expensive shoes echoed down the floating oak staircase. Julian Croft strode into the kitchen with the unshakable arrogance of a man who believed he was inventing the future. His suit was deceptively simple, custom-tailored Italian wool, but the watch on his wrist cost more than their entire prenatal care package. He was also wearing a cologne she didn't recognize. He didn't look at her stomach. He barely even glanced in her direction. His attention was completely consumed by his phone. She observed him, noting the slight, unconscious way his body was angled away from her, the shadow of a smile on his lips as his thumbs flew across the screen. "Our appointment with the specialist is at 2 o'clock, Eleanor said, her voice quiet. "Are you going to be there?" Julian replied without looking up. "I'm closing our Series C funding today. I can't just drop everything for a routine checkup." "It's not a routine checkup, Julian. The doctor has some new concerns. I really need you to come." That finally made him raise his head, his expression irritated and remote. "Someone has to pay for all of this, Eleanor," he retorted. "Or had you forgotten you haven't contributed a single dollar to this household in almost 3 years?" The insult landed like a physical blow, a familiar sharp sting, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She had shelved a prestigious, award-winning career in journalism to start a family with him. She had turned down international assignments and a book deal, and now he wielded that sacrifice like a club. Julian grabbed his leather messenger bag. He offered no kiss, no touch to her belly. He didn't even glance back at the woman carrying his son. "Julian," Eleanor said, just as his hand touched the doorknob. He let out a long-suffering sigh. "What now?" "Please, just try to be there." He said there might be some good news. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of something human crossed his features, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "We'll see," he said, his tone final. "I'm a very busy man." And with that, he was gone. The heavy front door clicked shut, leaving a cavernous, deafening silence in its wake. She pushed the bowl of untouched yogurt away, her appetite gone. She placed a hand over her belly, a silent question screaming in her mind. Why doesn't he care about us? The thought was a shard of ice in her chest. She hugged herself tightly. "Of course he loves us," she whispered to her baby, a lie that felt like acid on her tongue. "He's just under a lot of pressure with his company. He loves you more than anything." The words felt like poison, but how could she admit to herself, let alone to her unborn child, that its own father saw them as a distraction, a complication in his masterfully architected life? She felt a gentle flutter from inside, an innocent, trusting movement. "I love you," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I love you so much. More than anything in the entire world." She had no way of knowing she had less than 12 hours before that world would be utterly annihilated. Later, in the sterile, cold atmosphere of the specialist's office, she sat alone. The chairs were hard, the art on the walls bland and corporate. She had been waiting nearly an hour, and the seat next to her remained conspicuously empty. A nurse offered a sympathetic smile as she passed. She had seen Eleanor at every appointment, and she was always by herself. "Tech mogul husband saving the world?" the nurse asked, her tone a mix of pity and disapproval. Eleanor managed a weak smile. "Something like that. He's incredibly driven." The nurse's knowing nod spoke volumes. Her expression told a story she'd seen 1,000 times before. Just then, Eleanor's phone buzzed. It was a text from Julian. "Investor dinner. Don't wait up." She stared at the screen. Another investor dinner. She'd lost count of the endless late nights, the times he'd stumbled home before dawn smelling of a woman's perfume, always with a perfectly crafted excuse. For months, the instincts of a seasoned investigator had been screaming at her, but she'd suppressed them. Suspicion and proof were two very different animals, and a piece of her was terrified to learn the truth for certain. She silenced her phone and rested her hands on the gentle curve of her stomach. She would handle Julian later. In this moment, the only thing that mattered was the fragile life she was nurturing. Dr. Albright, a calm woman with empathetic eyes, regarded Eleanor with deep concern. She explained that Eleanor's blood pressure was dangerously high and the pregnancy was facing significant stress. The doctor's instructions were stark and non-negotiable. If she experienced any severe cramping or felt faint, she was to call 911 without a moment's hesitation. She was forbidden from driving herself to a hospital or hoping the feelings would pass. A cold wave of dread washed over Eleanor as she gave her promise. The doctor then spoke gently, reminding her that for the baby's health, it was critical to stay as calm and stress-free as humanly possible. Eleanor swore she would try her best. With that, the doctor scheduled an emergency follow-up and reiterated that she had to monitor her condition constantly. Eleanor left the office and stepped into the biting December wind. Her phone buzzed one last time. It was another text from Julian, claiming the dinner was running late and that he would be home well after 1 a.m. Amelia swiped the message away without a response. Later, she drew a warm bath, hoping the steam would dissolve the knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. A quiet, persistent dread whispered that her window of peace was closing. Every movement was slow and mindful as she spoke softly to her unborn child, preparing for a solitary evening. Tucked into bed, she opened a biography of a formidable female leader who dismantled every obstacle in her path, no matter how insurmountable. Though her eyes scanned the lines, her thoughts drifted far away. A question, sharp and cold, pierced through her unease. Are we going to make it through this? She pressed a hand to her chest, making a silent promise to the new life within her. We are survivors, you and me, she whispered to the baby safely cradled inside her. And survivors always find a way. Amelia closed her eyes, praying for the universe to prove her right. For a long while, she simply lay still, focusing on the gentle rhythm of her own breathing, trying to anchor herself to the present moment. That night, a sudden, blinding pain sent her scrambling for her husband, Liam. His phone went to voicemail, over and over. Consumed by panic, she reached for their shared tablet, planning to use their location-sharing app to find him. As the screen lit up, she saw his icon pinned at the Viceroy Hotel downtown. A notification from their calendar was also on the screen, an event created by a woman named Isabel. Gallery opening. You'd better be there, can't wait. There was no room to process the collapse of her world while fighting for her baby's life. I will deal with that later, she vowed. But her life was about to be irrevocably altered. At 11:23 p.m., a savage, breathtaking pain tore through her abdomen, jolting her awake. It was a searing agony that left her unable to breathe. She staggered into the hallway, leaving a smear of blood on the polished hardwood floors of their Chicago apartment as her body was racked by uncontrollable shivers. A terrifying warmth was spreading through her. The blood pressure cuff she used twice a day began to blare, its shrill alarm piercing the quiet of their Gold Coast home. She crumpled to the ground, a sickening feeling of helplessness washing over her as her hands trembled too violently to call Liam. The call rang out, unanswered. She ended it and tried again. Voicemail. She fumbled through a text. Something's wrong. Baby, U Chicago Medical Center. Get here. The read receipt confirmed he saw it at 10:47 p.m. Nothing. With no time left for the terror climbing her throat, she dialed 911. She clutched her belly, rocking back and forth. "Just hold on, little one," she whispered. "Mommy's here. Help is on the way, ma'am." The baby responded with a weak, fluttering movement. Her mind screamed the word she couldn't form with her lips. "Daddy. He's coming, my love." Amelia lied, her voice cracking into a sob. But he wasn't coming. Miles away, in a penthouse suite, with a view of Lake Michigan, renowned architect Liam Sterling was with Isabel Moreau. She was Amelia's opposite, a coolly ambitious art gallerist, fiercely independent, and free from the impending reality of a newborn. Liam's phone buzzed insistently on the marble wet bar. Isabel nodded toward the illuminated screen. "It's Amelia again," she noted, pushing the device toward him. "Seems urgent." Liam barely glanced up from his scotch. He waved it off, explaining that Amelia's pregnancy nerves had been on a hair trigger for months, turning every small ache into a catastrophe in her mind. He silenced the phone and flipped it face down. "If it were a real emergency," he said with confidence, "her doctor would call me." He told Isabel he was in the final throes of securing a massive new skyscraper commission. She shrugged, settling back against him. "You're right," she murmured. "She's probably just working herself up." Liam smiled, pulling her closer, completely oblivious to the desperate struggle for life happening just across the city. At that exact moment, an unborn child was losing her fight to live. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and frantic motion. Medics surrounded Amelia, inserting an IV line and shouting numbers about her blood pressure. Inside the hospital, a trauma team was mobilized, their voices a cacophony of clinical terms as she was wheeled toward surgery. Amelia clung to a paramedic's hand, pleading, "That's my baby in there. Please save her." A nurse with kind eyes took his place, promising they would do everything they could. Amelia felt disconnected from her own body, a spectator watching the frantic activity through the small window of the operating room door. She tried calling Liam one last, hopeless time, her words dissolving into a choked voicemail. At 11:51 p.m., the steady, rhythmic pulse of the fetal heart monitor was suddenly replaced by a long, unbroken tone. It was a sound that fractured Amelia's world into a million pieces. A surgeon stepped out, her expression etched with profound sorrow. The doctor didn't need to speak. Amelia already knew. "Mrs. Sterling," she said softly, "I am so, so sorry." The hallway tilted around her. We did all we could, but the placental abruption was too severe. Amelia's strength gave out, and she slid down the cold, sterile wall, a raw, guttural cry of agony tearing from her throat, echoing through the desolate quiet of the hospital corridor. Her beautiful daughter, her little Sophie, was gone. Much later, in the silent sanctuary of the hospital's meditation room at 2 in the morning, she held a tiny knitted cap a nurse had given her. She tried to imagine the sweet smell of the baby she would never hold. The tears had run dry, leaving behind a hollowed-out emptiness where her heart used to be. Her phone buzzed. It was an alert from their shared credit card, an account Liam managed. The subject line was a notification. "A charge has been approved." She opened it. It was an itemized bill for Liam Sterling, showing a check-in at the Viceroy Chicago at 10:58 p.m., charges for room service, and a final checkout time of 6 a.m. the next day. At the bottom, a cheerful line read, "We hope you enjoyed your stay." Amelia stared at the screen until the numbers blurred, and a strange, brittle laugh escaped her. It was the sound of a woman who had just had her entire future erased, only to find out it was stolen. It was the sound of sorrow hardening into something sharp and unbreakable. Her daughter had died alone while her father was with another woman, ignoring the calls that begged for him to be there. The laughter stopped, all emotion drained away. A cold, clear, and methodical purpose rushed in to fill the void, and within that chill, a plan began to take shape. She pressed the tiny cap to her cheek one last time. Then she placed it carefully in her handbag and rose to her feet. She would be home when Liam finally decided to return. Liam Sterling entered their apartment at 6 a.m., the scent of another woman's perfume faintly clinging to his coat, his excuse already perfected on his tongue. He stopped short when he saw Amelia sitting in the shadows of the living room, completely still. She was in the armchair facing the door, the small knitted cap in her lap. The tablet on the coffee table was on, displaying the credit card receipt from the hotel. Liam immediately launched into his prepared lie. "Amelia, my God, I'm so sorry. A pipe burst at the new construction site. Total disaster. I've been there all night. By the time I saw your messages, I assumed you were home and fine." Amelia simply looked at him, her quiet gaze pulling all the oxygen from the room. Liam shifted on his feet, unnerved. He had braced himself for tears and accusations, not this unnerving calm. "Is the baby okay?" he asked, his voice laced with a flicker of genuine concern. "Did you see the doctor?" Amelia finally spoke, her tone flat and devoid of any feeling. "Sophie died at 11:51 last night." Liam's confident demeanor shattered. "What?" he whispered. "I had a placental abruption. I called you 22 times. Your phone's data usage shows you were scrolling online." Liam grasped for a defense. "Amelia, it was on silent. I was in a meeting with the developers. I swear I didn't see them until after, and I thought it was just false labor. You always said I was just being an anxious first-time mother." Amelia gestured to the tablet. "The Viceroy. A suite. Billed for last night. $4,500 on our credit card." Liam's composure crumbled. He weighed his options and decided to lie again. "The firm booked it for the clients from Dubai. The flooding at the site meant we had to meet there. It's not what it looks like." Amelia raised her head, her eyes finally meeting his. "With Isabel Moreau? Your calendar said, 'Don't be late'?" The silence that followed was absolute. Liam's face cycled through guilt and panic before settling into a mask of aggressive indignation. "You're not thinking straight," he said, his tone becoming patronizing. "You've just suffered a terrible loss, and you're trying to find someone to blame. I understand. We can talk about this later, when you're feeling more rational." Amelia stood, her posture suddenly rigid and strong, no longer stooped by the weight of her pregnancy. "Her specialist said that my chronic stress was a significant risk factor," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I was terrified and I was bleeding out. Our daughter needed you, and you were with another woman." Liam took an involuntary step back, confronted by a cold resolve in her eyes he had never seen before. "Amelia, you're being hysterical. Grief is making you invent things. Let me call your doctor. We will get through this awful tragedy together." "Leave," she whispered, her eyes focused on the wall behind him. He tried to reclaim his authority. "This is our apartment, Chloe. I'm not going anywhere. You're having some kind of breakdown. You need help." She moved toward him, her expression turning to stone. "Before I quit my ethics position to manage your reputation, I was a federal regulator for the FDA. I know how to audit clinical trial data. I know about the falsified results you submitted for your last funding round. I know about the gene sequencing patent you stole from that university lab. I know which venture capitalists on your board would be very interested to learn about the advisory shares you granted yourself moments before the acquisition talks went public. So when I say leave, It is not a request. You have 5 minutes before I start making calls to my old colleagues at the Bureau of Biologics and the Boston Globe. For the first time in their marriage, Julian Vance looked genuinely frightened of his wife. He snatched his coat and was gone without another word. Chloe heard the front door slam shut, then her legs gave out and she fell to her knees, clutching a small hand-knitted blue booty. She allowed herself exactly 1 hour to fall apart, to sob and howl into the soft yarn. When the 60 minutes were up, she dried her face, stood on shaky legs, and picked up her phone. She scrolled to a name she hadn't called in 5 years. Someone Julian had convinced her was a controlling influence, forcing her to cut him out of her life. He's isolating you, Chloe. Her father's calm voice echoed in her mind. You'll have to choose. She had chosen Julian, and now she knew how wrong she'd been. With a finger that shook, she hit dial. Her father picked up on the first ring, his voice a solid, familiar comfort. Chloe. Dad, she managed to say, the word cracking in two. The baby's gone. And nothing he said was true. A moment of pure silence hung on the line before his voice returned, all warmth gone, replaced by the cool, sharp-edged precision she knew from her childhood. I'm on the next flight. Retired Superior Court Judge Arthur Blackwood landed at Logan Airport 12 hours later. When Chloe opened the door to her Beacon Hill apartment, she saw the years had etched new lines of authority onto his face. But his eyes hadn't changed. They were still keen, analytical, seeing everything. He absorbed the utter devastation in his daughter's features and simply pulled her into a hug. Pressed against his chest, Chloe's hard-won control shattered, and she wept with a raw grief she hadn't let herself feel until that moment. In the safety of his embrace, the walls she'd built came crashing down. I pushed you away, she cried. I believed him when he said you just wanted to control my life. I picked him over you, Dad, and now my son is gone, and my whole world is gone. Arthur held her tight. He engages in classic isolation tactics. Watching him do it to you was the hardest thing I've ever endured. But that's over now. He gently tilted her chin up, his hands framing her face in a gesture she remembered from when she was a little girl. Show me, he said, his tone gentle but unbreakable. Show me the proof. Without a word, she led him to her tablet. She pulled up the security feed from the Seaport penthouse Julian claimed he kept for investors. It was time-stamped from the night before. It showed Julian with another woman, laughing as he declined a call, her name and a string of emergency alerts, flashing on the screen of his phone. When the clip ended, Arthur stared at the dark screen, his jaw set like concrete. It was a look Chloe recognized, a judge weighing the gravity of a verdict. What do you want to happen now, Chloe? He asked. The agony in her heart had cooled into something solid and sharp. I want to tear down everything he's built, she said, her voice now steady and cold. His company, his reputation, his entire future. I want him to understand what it feels like to lose everything that matters. Arthur gave a single, firm nod. Then we will approach this as I would a prosecution, with precision, without passion, without a single misstep. We will collect the facts and construct a case so airtight he will have nowhere to run. When we are finished, Julian Vance will cease to exist in any meaningful way. He spoke with the quiet finality of a man who had pronounced sentences for a living. For the first time in days, Chloe felt something other than pure despair. Where do we begin? She asked. Arthur was already on his phone. We begin by acquiring a weapon. We need leverage, Arthur explained. You said Julian has offshore partnerships, R&D deals you were never privy to. We need an expert who can navigate that dark territory. Chloe didn't know anyone, but Arthur was already a step ahead. Maya Singh. She was the sharpest law clerk I ever had. Now she's the most sought-after digital forensics consultant for Boston's biotech VCs. Chloe looked at him. Someone you used to know? You've mentioned her. A shadow of regret passed over Arthur's features. I should have maintained the connection. The corporate world has a way of changing people, but she was brilliant. Will she help us? Chloe asked. Arthur thought of Maya's razor-sharp mind and her utter contempt for corruption. She'll take my call. She always had a deep respect for the rule of law. Then ask her, Chloe pleaded. I just did, Arthur said, disconnecting the call. She's meeting us in the morning. Her first question was about his encrypted data storage. I only know what he's told me, Chloe admitted. He has an encrypted server in Switzerland for his international partners. Maya's voice cut in through the speakerphone. Then the first step is a full forensic clone of his home office network. My people can crack anything. Is that even legal? Chloe whispered. Maya's response was immediate and sharp. Legality is determined by the evidence you present. The next day, they met Maya in a minimalist conference room overlooking the harbor. The mutual respect between her and Arthur was immediate and obvious. But when Maya's gaze fell on Chloe, her professional armor fissured for a heartbeat, revealing a flicker of profound empathy. Judge, she said with a nod, then addressed Chloe. I am so deeply sorry for your loss. After that brief, shared moment of humanity, the businesslike calm returned. They sat around a table with coffee they didn't touch. We need your help, Maya, Arthur said, dispensing with pleasantries. Not as a favor to an old mentor. We need the absolute best. And that's you. Maya nodded slowly. I can run the digital trace, Judge, but my gut tells me this is more than a simple marital dispute. Chloe slid a tablet across the glass table. On the screen was a folder filled with scanned corporate filings. Over the last few years, Julian had me digitally sign dozens of formation documents. He told me they were for our family's trust. I was his wife. I trusted him. I never read the fine print. Maya's eyes flew across the screen, her expression hardening with every line. This is not a family trust, Maya said, her tone clipped. These are incorporation papers for a series of biomedical research firms in Liechtenstein. Chloe, if that's your digital signature on these, this is far worse than an affair. What do you mean? Chloe asked, her voice barely audible. I mean, we need to find out what he had you authorize. If these companies were used to sell proprietary data or launder money, your name makes you a director. The color drained from Chloe's face. So, he wasn't just cheating on me, he was framing me to take the fall. That appears to be the strategy, Maya confirmed, her voice softening just a fraction. But there is a silver lining. If we can prove he deceived you into signing, a classic case of fraudulent inducement, we can turn it all back on him. He takes the fall. You walk away. How do we prove that? We create a timeline. Every document he gave you, every text message, every conversation you can remember. Arthur's eyes were like shards of flint. I can do that. My memory is perfect. Chloe looked from Maya to her father. He told me, the two of you barely spoke. Arthur's jaw was rigid. A father-in-law's disapproval becomes a secondary concern when his grandchild dies, because his son-in-law was with a mistress, instead of answering his pregnant wife's emergency calls. Old arguments suddenly become meaningless. Maya looked at Arthur, her face a mask. Years ago, I told you to be careful of the ethics in the biotech gold rush, Judge. I wasn't being cynical. I was worried that men like him would eventually cross your path. You were right to be worried, Arthur said softly. I'm sorry I dismissed your concerns. No need for apologies, Maya said. Just be ready for what's coming, because I'm in this, with you until the end. For the first time since leaving the hospital, Chloe felt the unshakable strength of an alliance. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Maya allowed herself a small, grim smile. Save your thanks. We'll celebrate when we see him indicted. The next few weeks were a blur of digital archaeology as Maya's team of white hat hackers worked nonstop. During that period, Chloe changed. The grief was a permanent weight in her chest, but it was now honed into a deadly, sharp point of focus. She went through years of her digital life, pinpointing every document Julian had pushed her to sign when she was exhausted or distracted. He had turned her complete faith in him into a weapon against her. In parallel, Maya's lead analyst managed to clone Julian's entire Swiss server. 2 weeks later, they had a perfect copy of his secret professional life. The truth was worse than any of them had imagined. A sprawling web of offshore labs, untraceable crypto payments, and shadow ledgers. Maya presented the findings on a secure video conference. Hundreds of millions of dollars were moving through corporations that bore her digital signature, corporations she didn't know existed. It confirmed their worst fears, a massive scheme selling stolen, unpatented, genetic data to foreign rivals. The only unknown was whether Julian was the mastermind or just a well-paid pawn. Arthur studied the transaction records, his legal mind identifying patterns in the chaos. He saw payments originating from entities far too powerful for Julian to be controlling himself. "He's not the king on this board," Arthur said quietly. "He's a rook. Someone else is controlling the game." Finding the puppet masters could wait. They already had enough to set the entire board on fire. 3 weeks after she lost her son, Chloe sat with her father in Maya Singh's office. Camilla had a secure drive containing irrefutable proof of Julian's investment fraud and his affair, but the most damning evidence was a transcript from the encrypted chat logs. It showed Julian's conversation, his companion Sloane, and the exact moment a notification with Eleanor's name flashed on his screen during her medical emergency. Robert read the words again as his son-in-law, in cold text, typed, "Handle it later," and casually dismissed the alert. He then sent a flippant emoji to the woman he was with and put his phone aside. "It was a deliberate choice," Robert said, his voice a low rumble of fury. "He saw her name and chose to ignore her." Camilla nodded. "This transcript alone will obliterate their prenup. With the financial crimes, he's looking at federal prison. Are you ready to move forward?" Eleanor stared at the evidence, a digital autopsy of the life she thought she had. She thought of her unborn child, and the countless nights she'd accepted Julian's excuses about late-night coding sessions. "Expose him," she said, her voice brittle as glass. As Camilla prepared to contact their lawyer, Robert's encrypted messaging app buzzed. It was a message from an anonymous account. A familiar, cold dread pooled in his stomach as he read the words, "Old journalists should learn when to stop digging." Attached was a live photograph of Eleanor, captured through the large window of her architecture firm just moments before. He showed the phone to Camilla. "Is that Julian?" Eleanor whispered. "No," Robert answered, his tone grim. "Julian is a narcissist, but he lacks this level of professional menace. This is from his investors, the ones who know we're about to unravel their whole operation." "Do we hold off?" Camilla asked, her finger hovering over the send button. Robert considered the threat, his posture hardening with decades of journalistic resolve. "No, we leak the story in the morning," he declared. "We push forward and see which rats scurry from the ship." Camilla offered a sharp, approving nod. "It's good to see you haven't lost your edge, Robert," she said. The story broke in a major financial journal on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, Robert's well-ordered life had been turned upside down. 2 grim-faced agents from the FBI were waiting by his study. "I am Special Agent Klein," the lead agent said without preamble. "We have some questions for you regarding a private investment vehicle named Innovest Holdings." A knot of ice formed in Robert's gut. It was one of the shell companies from the documents. Your signature appears on the incorporation papers as a primary consultant. Agent Klein continued, his tone dripping with suspicion. We have some concerns about its funding sources. I have zero knowledge of that entity. My son-in-law had me sign some documents years ago, claiming it was for a joint property tax strategy, he explained. That's a popular excuse, the second agent said, with a cynical smirk. They interrogated him for 3 punishing hours. By the end, Robert felt as though he'd been flayed. They had bank records and offshore wire transfers, all mapping out a massive pump-and-dump scheme with what looked like his signature authorizing every transaction. After they left, the sickening reality crashed down on him. Julian hadn't just been unfaithful to his daughter. He hadn't just abandoned her and their unborn child. He had spent years meticulously building a legal trap, and Robert was the one who had just walked right into it. His phone buzzed. An untraceable number. The text read, "You should have stayed retired." A second message came through, this one a link to a tech gossip blog. The headline read, "Legendary journalist Robert Hayes investigated for elder financial abuse." It alleged Robert was manipulating his vulnerable, pregnant daughter to extort money from his son-in-law. Then, Camilla called, "Robert, we have a 5-alarm fire." "I'm aware. The FBI just left." "This is worse," Camilla said, her voice tight with urgency. "Julian launched a preemptive PR assault, and the narrative he's spinning is horrific." "What narrative?" "He's claiming you mismanaged Eleanor's prenatal care. He's telling the world your constant pressure and erratic obsession with his business caused her so much stress that it triggered her high-risk complications. He's positioning himself as the devoted husband trying to protect her from you." "That is a complete and utter fabrication," Robert choked out. "I postponed my book deal to support Eleanor. I went to every single specialist appointment. Julian never showed up once." "I know that," Camilla said, "but he's controlling the media cycle. His mother is planting stories with socialites all over the Bay Area, and the narrative is taking hold. He's trying to completely discredit you before you can discredit him. How do we fight it?" "We use the truth as our weapon," Camilla declared. "The affair, the fraudulent SEC filings, the server logs showing he ignored her texts for hours during her emergency. We have to prove you were systematically deceived, but that could take months. In the meantime, you could face indictment." Robert felt the book-lined walls of his study start to close in on him. A month ago, his biggest problem was his daughter's difficult pregnancy and her failing marriage. Now he was grieving for a grandchild he might never hold and was the primary person of interest in a federal fraud case. "Have you spoken to my son?" he asked. "Ethan called me an hour ago," Camilla replied. "He said to tell you to sit tight. He's on a plane to Zurich chasing a lead, but he was cryptic about the details. I've known your son a long time." When Robert Hayes broke a story, he didn't just report the facts. He exposed the rot beneath them. "I hope so," Eleanor whispered to her empty design studio. "I really, really hope so." The next 2 weeks were a public crucifixion. Faces she knew from the San Francisco design community would suddenly become fascinated with a light fixture across the room when she entered. On a popular tech blog, an anonymous source painted her as a greedy wife complicit in her family's financial schemes. Eleanor slammed her laptop shut, turning away from the blueprints for a nursery, refusing to give the trolls the victory of her tears. Back in the quiet of her studio, she sank into a designer chair, her fingers tracing the smooth lines of a 3D model of the home she designed for her new family. She cried until her temples ached and her eyes felt raw. She just sat, wrapped in the silence, wondering if this was how it ended. not with a dramatic confrontation, but a slow public erasure. Her phone vibrated, a text from her father. "I'm on my way up." When he walked in, he saw his daughter looking fragile and defeated. He didn't offer hollow reassurances. He simply watched her with his familiar, analytical gaze. "You're making a critical mistake," he said, his voice firm. "You're confusing the headline with the truth. Dad, Julian has the most vicious PR firm in Silicon Valley on retainer. The government thinks I'm part of his scheme. I have nothing left to fight with." Robert leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "That's where you're wrong. You have the documents, you have your integrity, and you have me. I did not spend 40 years taking down corrupt institutions to let some tech bro with a messiah complex ruin my daughter. We are not going to fight him on social media or in the gossip columns," Robert told her. "We are going to take the fight to his boardroom. And every single person who enabled his lies will be subpoenaed as a material witness to his collapse. By the time we are done, Julian Croft will be radioactive in this valley. Then he will finally learn the meaning of being truly bankrupt." The meeting was in a private conference room at a venture capital summit in Palo Alto, a place of quiet power and billion-dollar deals, paneled in reclaimed wood and smelling of ambition. Robert Hayes sat at a long glass table, waiting. Seated across from him were three people in expensive casual wear, the founding partners of Julian Croft's primary backers, Momentum Ventures. "Gentlemen, Ms. Chen," Robert began with a polite, steady smile, "I appreciate you seeing me. I know how valuable your time is." The senior partner, Olivia Chen, gave a short, impatient nod. "Mr. Hayes, your reputation precedes you. When you request a meeting, one assumes a story is about to drop. Tell us why you're here." "This isn't about the story I'm planning to write, but rather the one you can help me avoid writing," Robert said, sliding a thin, encrypted data stick across the table. "I've found some significant failures in your due diligence, all originating with the last funding round for your star partner, Julian Croft." The three partners exchanged guarded looks. The youngest partner, a data genius named David, spoke first. "What kind of failures?" Robert tapped the data stick, which contained a complex map of shell corporations and wire transfers. "Your flagship disruptor fund, the core of your growth strategy. It's been used to artificially inflate the valuation of a portfolio company, allowing Mr. Croft to siphon millions. The fraud is buried under layers of falsified performance metrics that only Julian had the credentials to manipulate." A thick, heavy silence fell over the room. "I am certain," Robert said evenly, "that this information is as alarming to you as it was to me. I know you would not want the Momentum Ventures brand associated with wire fraud and SEC violations." Olivia Chen, the senior partner, finally spoke, her voice like broken glass. "Why come to us? Why not go directly to the Wall Street Journal?" Robert explained he wanted to give them a chance to control the narrative. He pointed out that if this became a federal case, the fallout wouldn't be contained to just Julian Croft. The headlines would be about the board's catastrophic failure of oversight. Investor confidence has a way of evaporating when the story is about gross negligence at the leadership level. The implication was stark and unavoidable. David's face had lost all color, and the third partner was nervously fiddling with his smartwatch. "What's the ask?" Eleanor asked, her tone clipped and sharp. Julian had only one demand. He wanted Liam Sterling's partnership terminated immediately with a public announcement citing professional misconduct. He also required the firm to issue a formal retraction of all accusations against his daughter. "And if we say no," the firm's CFO, Mr. Davies, interjected, "then this forensic report and the full dossier it summarizes goes directly to the editor of Architectural Digest The FBI's cybercrime division and a few influential developers I happened to play golf with. Julian let the threat hang in the air, explaining that the ensuing scandal would tarnish everyone, but the leadership of a world-renowned architecture firm would suffer the most catastrophic reputational damage. Eleanor stared at him, then took the offered tablet and started scrolling through the technical analysis. Julian waited, perfectly still, nursing a glass of sparkling water. He watched their expressions shift from defiance to disbelief as they absorbed the irrefutable evidence of the frame job. Finally, Eleanor set the tablet down and exchanged a look with her partners. A silent consensus was reached in an instant. "We will need our own team to corroborate this," Eleanor stated, her voice strained. "By all means," Julian said, rising smoothly and fastening the button on his suit jacket. "But time is of the essence." He walked toward the boardroom door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "On a more personal level, my daughter is 7 months pregnant with Liam's child. Her professional license is under review, and her name is on a federal watch list because Mr. Sterling was compromised. So, you see, my asking you to merely fire him is an act of profound mercy." He let the door click shut behind him. Less than 48 hours later, the head of human resources and 2 in-house attorneys intercepted Liam Sterling as he stepped off the elevator into the main design studio. "Mr. Sterling," the HR director said flatly, "we need a word with you." "What's this about?" Liam asked, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "There are some irregularities regarding the Metropolis Tower project files. The partners need to see you." Liam followed them, striding toward the executive conference room. He could feel the hush fall over the studio, the draftsmen and junior architects staring as he passed. Inside, the 3 senior partners were seated, their expressions unreadable. "Liam, take a seat," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of warmth. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, remaining standing. "We are placing you on immediate, indefinite administrative leave, pending a comprehensive investigation into a severe breach of client confidentiality and intellectual property theft." Arthur's face turned a deep, alarming shade of crimson. "This is absurd. I can account for every single design change." "I'm certain you believe you can," Eleanor retorted, her voice cold as steel. "But in the interim, your access to all Sterling Capital properties and systems is hereby revoked, effective immediately. Security will escort you to your desk so you can retrieve your personal effects." "You can't be serious," Arthur shouted, the sound echoing off the glass walls of the silent boardroom. "We already are," Mr. Davies stated, sliding an official letter across the polished oak table. It was the formal declaration of his suspension without pay. He noted that Arthur was free to contact his legal counsel, but advised him that creating a scene would be unwise. The industry blogs would have a feeding frenzy with footage of a star architect being physically removed from his own firm. Arthur's gaze shot from the letter to the partners' unyielding faces, and then to the security personnel, standing impassively by the door. For the very first time, a genuine flicker of fear appeared in his eyes. "This isn't over," he sputtered. "You're making a monumental error." "Perhaps," Eleanor conceded with chilling composure. "But it's our firm to defend. Good day, Mr. Sterling." Chloe discovered her husband Arthur had been fired not from him, but from a call from her father. "It's handled. He's gone," Julian said, his voice resolute. Chloe collapsed onto the edge of her sofa, her hand instinctively cradling her pregnant belly. "How did you manage it so quickly?" she asked, her voice just above a whisper. "I provided the board with an unavoidable conclusion," he replied. "They simply made the only logical choice for their business." "So what happens now?" Chloe asked. "Now we wait," he instructed. "Arthur is trapped. He's going to panic. He will reach out to his co-conspirator for an escape plan. We'll be ready to see who answers that call." As for the federal case against you, your lawyer is making significant headway. The forensic team confirmed the skyscraper blueprints were tampered with after you'd logged off for the day, which proves someone else added that data mining code to frame you. This confirms you weren't the one who compromised the project. We just have to find out who was. Chloe exhaled a shaky breath, feeling a tiny ray of hope for the first time in months. "Thank you, Dad," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Don't thank me just yet," he responded. "This is far from finished." The next critical piece of the puzzle came from Zara. 3 days later, she phoned Chloe, her voice electric with discovery. "I have a positive identification on the woman Arthur has been meeting with, a Genevieve Dubois, and what I've uncovered is staggering." "What is it?" Chloe asked, her pulse quickening. "She's no mere mistress. She orchestrated this entire affair from the beginning." Zara laid out how Genevieve had been compiling a dossier on Arthur for nearly 2 years. Long before she initiated contact, she had intimate knowledge of Chloe's family, particularly her father's influential career. "But for what purpose?" Chloe asked, completely baffled. "Because this is her trade," Zara said grimly. "She's a specialist in corporate espionage. She adopts new identities for each target. I found her digital footprints connected to similar sabotage plots in Singapore and Berlin. Her real name is likely buried under a mountain of fake passports, but her methods are identical." A horrifying clarity began to dawn on Chloe. Arthur wasn't the predator. He was the bait Genevieve had used to infiltrate the firm. But why target Sterling Capital? It's a top firm, but not the absolute biggest. Zara's tone became serious. This was never about the firm itself. She chose Arthur as the most direct route to you, and she chose you to gain leverage over your father, Julian Vance. My father's reputation, the confidential information he has from his years as a prosecutor. She wanted to blackmail him. He has access to sealed case files and a network of informants that a person like Genevieve would view as the ultimate prize. A wave of nausea rolled over Chloe. She had been fighting the wrong enemy all along. Arthur was a fool, a pawn. Genevieve was the queen. "Does my father know this?" she asked. "He's receiving the full briefing as we speak," Zara confirmed. "And he's livid. There's something else. The payments for the stolen data, the ones laundered through crypto wallets opened in your name, were all eventually moved to a secondary, untraceable network of accounts. Accounts that belong solely to Genevieve. She was double-crossing her own asset, and my husband Arthur had no idea. Her plan was to grab the money and vanish, leaving both of us to face the consequences and likely federal prison time." The sheer scale of the betrayal was nauseating. I had already lost my reputation, my marriage, and the career I loved, all because of a woman I didn't even know existed. So, what was our countermove? My father, Julian, had a plan. "We let the jackals fight over the scraps," he said, "and then we leak the video of the fight." The strategy was as simple as it was vicious. Genevieve had been manipulating Arthur for years. We just had to show him the strings. His colossal ego would handle the rest. It started with a series of anonymous data packets, little morsels of truth sent to Arthur via encrypted messaging apps he thought were untraceable. A tip from an old colleague who saw something, a cropped screenshot of a hidden bank ledger from a burner phone. A piece of a recovered audio file, masterfully edited, landed in his inbox. Each piece of the puzzle painted the same deeply humiliating picture. Genevieve wasn't his partner in crime, she was his handler, and she was preparing to cut him loose and serve him up to the authorities to save herself. Arthur, being the textbook narcissist that he was, predictably imploded. He barged into Genevieve's penthouse apartment overlooking the Chicago River, his face a chilling mask of controlled rage. "You've been playing me," he seethed, his voice barely a whisper. "This whole time, the offshore payments, you were bleeding them dry. You were framing me to be the sole target of the investigation." Genevieve, to her credit, seemed entirely unruffled. She had planned for this exact scenario. "Sweetheart, you're becoming hysterical. Whatever ridiculous story you've cooked up, I assure you, it's a complete fantasy." He slid a tablet across her marble island, its screen illuminating her face with a cold, digital glow. "Explain this," Arthur hissed. It was a file from a ghost partition on her server she believed was impenetrable. It contained their private communications, financial projections, and disturbingly accurate psychological profiles, a meticulously crafted plan for industrial espionage, with him cast as the disposable pawn. "These are the contingency plans you swore were just for our protection," he said, his voice trembling with fury. Genevieve casually picked up the device, tapping her long nails against the back. Her expression was a perfect portrait of boredom. But the slight tremor in her hand told a different story. You could practically see the calculations running behind her eyes as she looked for a way out. "Where did you find this?" Isabel asked, her voice deceptively mild. "Does it really matter? You've been playing me for a year. Every venture capital connection I made, every all-nighter I pulled for our startup. Was it all just to create enough instability to gut the company and sell the IP? Was any of our partnership real, or was I just another asset you planned to liquidate?" Isabel simply glanced at the laptop, her expression shifting to something that almost resembled pity. "Oh, Julian," she sighed, her voice laced with a theatrical disappointment. "You've never been able to see the bigger picture, have you? Every single decision was for us. The strategy was always to use the startup as a launchpad, secure our financial freedom, and build our own private equity firm, somewhere far away where no one could ever challenge us." "Our future?" Julian scoffed, the sound sharp and ugly. "You were planning to use my pregnant wife's art foundation as a shell to launder money. I was creating a necessary firewall to protect our investment." Isabel corrected him smoothly. "There is a significant difference. Your wife's digital signature is all over the grant proposals for that new digital art exhibit. She's the first person the feds would look at. As soon as the questions start, she becomes the center of the investigation, and we simply vanish." "And those offshore crypto wallets?" "That was merely our contingency fund," Isabel murmured, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a low, persuasive hum. "But none of that is necessary now. We can still have everything we worked for." Julian just stared at her, his thoughts a storm of betrayal and fury. For one terrifying moment, he seemed to waver, as if the sheer force of his ambition for her might overwhelm his conscience. But it didn't. "I believed in you," he said, his voice flat and deadened. "I was willing to risk my own child for you. I detonated my entire life for you, and your plan was to strip me of my company and let me take the fall. Julian, just listen to me." "No," he said with finality, taking a step back toward the penthouse door. "It's done. I'm not going to prison for you." He turned and left. For a beat, Isabel stood completely still, and then her meticulously crafted facade cracked, revealing the glacial rage that always churned just beneath the surface. Julian went straight to the district attorney's office. He detailed the entire conspiracy, from the fraudulent investor reports to Isabelle Laurent's true intentions. He skillfully presented himself as the idealistic victim, a tech visionary who was manipulated by a predatory venture capitalist. The investigators listened, filled pages with notes, and immediately began placing calls. 24 hours later, a team of federal agents raided Isabel's waterfront office in Sausalito to take her into custody. She wasn't there, but they located her at a downtown co-working space where she was trying to remotely wipe the startup's cloud servers. They arrested her in the middle of the open plan office, in front of at least 50 other people. The light from cell phone cameras was blinding. The story was on every tech blog within the hour. A gorgeous, high-flying VC in a designer suit being escorted out in handcuffs. With my lawyer, Sophia, sitting next to me, I watched the entire scene play out on a live feed. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt a spark of hope. "It's truly over, right?" I asked. "She's been arrested. Julian gave them everything. They'll be investigating her now, not me." Sophia nodded, but her expression was still wary. "It's a very strong start. The DA is moving forward with the idea that you were another one of her unwitting victims. The digital money trail, the fabricated donation letters, it all proves your innocence. So I'm in the clear. You're in the clear." I released a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for the last 6 months. My gaze drifted to the framed ultrasound photo of my son, Leo, on the side table. "We made it, little one," I whispered. "It's finally finished." But it wasn't. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Sophia, and her voice was laced with panic. "They dropped every last charge against Isabel." "What are you talking about?" "The server logs are gone. The entire encrypted evidence file Julian provided has been corrupted. It's just static now." "But that was on a secure government cloud. Someone would need top-level clearance to erase that data," I protested, my voice starting to tremble. "How is that even possible?" "I don't know," Eleanor replied, "but the investigation is completely dead, and Isabelle Laurent is walking free. And Eleanor, there is more." "How can there possibly be more?" "She knows it was you," Sophia said, her voice grim. "She knows you were the one who convinced Julian to go to the DA, and she will not let that go." I sagged onto the sofa, the fragile hope I'd felt just hours before dissolving into a cold, familiar terror. "So now she's coming after me." "She's coming after all of us," Sophia corrected. The first attack came that very evening. I drove to my father's house to figure out our next move, only to find an ambulance in his driveway, its lights flashing silently against the trees. Paramedics were wheeling him out on a gurney. His face was a terrible shade of gray. He fought for every single breath, a hand clamped to his chest. "Dad!" I cried out, rushing toward him. "What happened?" "It's his heart medication," one of the EMTs told me. "His cardiologist's office supposedly called in a forged cancellation for his prescription this morning. He's having a massive cardiac event. We have to leave now. Are you his daughter?" "Yes, I am." I scrambled into the ambulance and clasped my father's cold hand in mine. "Dad, please, just hold on." Robert's eyes fluttered open. His grip was weak, but his stare was like iron. "You cannot stop," he whispered, his voice raspy. "No matter what she does, you finish this. Promise me, Eleanor." "I promise." His eyes closed once more. As the paramedics moved urgently around him, I could only sit there, frozen by the horrifying thought of how much more I could possibly lose. Robert was stabilized after several terrifying hours, but the doctors warned that he would be in the hospital for weeks. I felt completely adrift, but things were about to get worse. My phone buzzed. It was Sophia, and I braced myself for more bad news. "I have to withdraw as your legal counsel," she said, her voice filled with a strained agony. "What? Sophia, no, you can't." "Isabel's people found something from my past," she said, her voice beginning to crack. "A sealed complaint from when I was a public defender. If I don't step away, they will leak it and have me disbarred. My practice, my family. She will destroy everything." "Sophia, Please, I pleaded. You told me you would see this through to the end with me. A long, agonizing silence filled the air, broken only by a choked sob from her side of the call. I am so sorry, Eleanor. I wish I had the strength to fight her, but I don't. I have 2 children to think about. I understand, I said, even as an enraged part of me didn't understand in the slightest. Thank you for all your help. I pray to God you find a way to beat her, Sophia whispered. And then the line went dead. I sat alone in the cold, impersonal waiting area of the hospital, just another anonymous figure in a room of strangers. My father was in the cardiac unit, my lawyer and best friend had abandoned me, and my adversary was not only free, but actively destroying my life. I had never been so thoroughly and completely alone. I stared at the off-white wall, the silence of the room feeling like a physical pressure. The only positive thing was that my dad was still alive. The negative was quite literally every other part of my life. Isabel was free, and Julian was undoubtedly negotiating a deal to protect himself, framing himself as her greatest victim. Every legal path we had explored was now a dead end. That was when the text messages began. They came from anonymous, encrypted sources, each one a meticulously crafted psychological assault. Did your little art history degree make you think you could mastermind my defeat? A man your father's age is so dependent on his medication. All of your support has evaporated. I am going to dismantle your life piece by piece, and you will have no choice but to watch. I deleted every single one without replying. I knew she was provoking me, trying to find a weakness, a flicker of fear. I refused to grant her that satisfaction, but in the middle of the night, with the quiet hum of the hospital's machinery as a backdrop, it was impossible not to feel my world shrinking around me. Eleanor felt as if she were drowning in despair. What was the point of fighting any longer? Her son, Leo, had not even been born, and his life was already a war zone. Julian and Isabel were untouchable. She felt like a total and complete failure. She pulled up the most recent ultrasound image from her phone, her finger tracing the tiny, perfect outline of her son's profile. I have already failed you, she whispered to the image. A deep, agonizing wave of sorrow washed over her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to truly break down and cry. For what felt like a lifetime, she had been pushing down the rising tide of panic and heartache. A little while later, a young intern gently touched her arm. "Mrs. Sterling," he said softly, "your husband is awake now. He's asking for you." Lying in that private hospital room, Julian looked a decade older, made smaller by the tangle of wires and sensors monitoring his heart, but when Eliza entered, his gaze locked onto hers, as sharp and intense as ever. "You look exhausted," he said, his voice a dry rasp. Eliza managed a weak smile. "You should see the other guy," she replied. "Good point," he conceded, gesturing towards a leather armchair by the window. "Please, sit. Tell me what happened." Eliza explained everything. She told him about the core design servers being wiped, Serafina's chilling phone call, and how every ounce of her courage had completely vanished. Julian listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he asked one sharp question. "So you're giving up?" "I don't see what else we can do," she confessed, her voice empty. "Yes, you do," he countered immediately. "You're my wife. You're the sharpest data analyst I've ever known, and you are not about to let that sociopathic architect win." "But she already won, Julian. She took it all." "She sabotaged our initial launch," he corrected her. "That is not the same as taking everything." He grimaced, trying to adjust himself against the pillows. "Back when I was a rookie architect, my mentor had a saying for this. He called it getting your blueprints burned. Your investors pull out, your permits are mysteriously revoked, your entire project is dead in the water. It feels final. But for him, that was always the moment to start a fresh design. He went on, "Our first approach was too conventional, too by the book. Of course, it was going to fail against someone who bribes the officials who write the book. So now we get creative." A wry smile she hadn't seen since they first met appeared on his face. "Serafina has a past," he stated with total conviction. "With other firms, other partners, you have to find them. People like her collect enemies, and a ruined business owner never deletes the emails. Find the careers she's torpedoed, and you'll find the evidence she thinks is long gone." She told him she wouldn't even know where to begin searching. "You start with public records," he guided her. "City planning archives, business and corporation filings, old articles from architecture journals." Serafina has been doing this for 15 years. She's left a path of financial ruin all over Chicago. You just have to know how to see the pattern. "And what happens when I find these people?" she asked. "Then you offer them something Serafina never expected," Julian said, a fierce glint in his eye. "You offer them a chance to rebuild, a chance for justice. You form an alliance." "An alliance?" The thought was daunting. "Serafina's strategy is to isolate her targets," he clarified. "She targets designers without deep pockets or political connections. She knows they're easy to crush, one by one. But if all of you press charges together," he concluded, "you might just be powerful enough to demolish her entire firm." The strategy was incredibly risky, but for the first time in ages, it felt real. It was a path forward. "I'll try," she said. He gave a slight shake of his head. "No, you'll do it. For us, and for our baby. Surrendering is not in our vocabulary." She gave him a slow, deliberate nod. She leaned down, kissed his forehead, and promised to let him rest. She had research to begin. For the next 3 days, she dove into a world of digital city archives. She navigated through mountains of permit applications and forgotten trade articles, her skills as an analyst, finally finding a new focus as she hunted for a specific signature. She searched for design firms and families driven to bankruptcy by stolen blueprints, patent fraud, and targeted smear campaigns. It started with a photo from an old trade, gala. Gradually, a clear pattern took shape. She discovered a collapsed landscape architecture firm in Boston from 2018. The founder, a celebrated designer, was accused of plagiarism by his own investors right before he lost his company. Then she found a failed commercial developer in Miami from 2016 and a family-owned engineering firm in Denver from 2014. The method was identical in each case, and lurking in the background of old award ceremony photos, she saw the same woman, the same face with different company names, Serafina Vance, then Selena Vale, then Sienna Velez. 3 different identities, but one single predator. She gathered every byte of data into a new, heavily encrypted file. While most of the victims had vanished from the industry, one name kept popping up in old, obscure online forums for engineers, a lone voice trying to warn people. Leo Martinez. She traced him to a quiet suburb in Wisconsin, where he now ran a small IT consulting business from his basement. It took 4 emails before he responded, his message filled with distrust. "My name is Eliza Sterling," she had written. "I believe a woman we both know is trying to destroy my husband's firm." After a whole day of agonizing silence, a brief message landed in her inbox. Serafina. That's who she was when she stole my designs and dismantled my career. "I know," she typed, her fingers trembling slightly as she replied. "She is doing the same thing to my family as we speak, and I need your help." After another long, tense wait, Leo wrote back, "I kept everything, every altered blueprint, every fraudulent invoice. I always knew another one of her victims would come looking for her one day. "Tell me where you are," she replied instantly. "I'm driving up tomorrow." For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a small, determined flame of hope. Leo Martinez worked from a crowded home office that smelled of stale coffee and ozone from old computer hardware. The windows were covered with blackout curtains, fighting the afternoon sun. Leo himself looked much older than his 52 years, his expression etched with a deep, permanent weariness. "You have to be Eliza," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Please come in." His office was more than a workspace, it was an archive. Stacks of external hard drives and labeled binders were piled on every available surface. "For years I've been waiting," Leo said, his voice a quiet rumble in the noisy diner, "waiting for someone to appear who could actually use the proof I saved." He gestured to a rugged, encrypted laptop. "I have it all. Every secret message Serafina sent to her mole, every line of code he stole for her. I tracked their digital communications for 2 years after she ruined me. I archived everything, just waiting for this day." He pushed a heavy-duty, encrypted hard drive across the vinyl tabletop for someone who can fight back for real. On the screen, she could see folders filled with damning design files, audio recordings, and secretly taken photographs. It was a complete record of industrial espionage, stretching back years. She asked him why he never took it to the police. "I tried," he said, his voice filled with contempt. "They were either on her payroll, or her powerful board members made sure the case was dismissed. Serafina is shielded by layers of money and influence. Every time I thought I had a case, a key witness would suddenly recant their story, and I would be dismissed as some disgruntled, unstable engineer. So, you just gave up?" Her eyes met his. "I survived," he corrected her. "There's a difference. I ran out of money for attorneys, but I held on to all this, hoping someone with more at stake, more to lose, would eventually show up." She thought about her unborn son and the future she and Julian were trying to build. "I have every reason to fight," she told him. "Then take this," he said, putting the drive firmly in her hands. "Use every last file. Make that woman pay for what she's done." The scope of Serafina's treachery was staggering. She had systematically destroyed at least 3 other companies. But this was going to be the end of the line. This time, she would have to answer to Eliza. Knowing she needed legal firepower, Eliza called her mentor. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "I need your help, Isabel. One last project. Completely off the record." Isabel, a retired federal prosecutor, hesitated, knowing how well-connected Serafina was. But Eliza insisted this was different. It was an analog case, based on physical evidence with no digital trail to erase. Then she delivered the crucial news. "I found Leo Martinez." Leo was a legend, a ghost story whispered among young engineers for years, the man who had supposedly saved everything. Not cloud data that could be wiped remotely, but physical drives. He possessed years of server backups and original design files linking Serafina to intellectual property theft across 3 states. "What is it you need from me?" Isabel asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eliza's plan was audacious. She wanted to build watertight cases with multiple state and federal agencies and deliver all of them at the exact same time. Serafina had allies in the city government who made her problems vanish, but she couldn't stop simultaneous investigations from the FBI, the IRS, and the state attorney general. Isabel was silent for a long moment, then called the plan absolutely brilliant. But a second later, she let out a sharp, appreciative laugh. "Okay," she said, "send me a sample of the evidence." The next 2 weeks passed in a furious blur. Eliza worked 18-hour days. Her mentor, Isabel, a retired prosecutor, organized their legal attack from her home office through secure channels. Liam, a contact of Isabel's, identified the toughest investigators at the Department of Justice and the IRS. Leo provided the critical technical evidence that tied all the crimes together. Slowly but surely, they constructed a formidable, multi-pronged case against Serafina Velis. When the day came, they gathered in Isabel's study. Her mentor was out of her retirement, looking tired but resolute. The journalist, Liam, stood by the window, nervous but committed. Leo had even driven down from his home in Wisconsin. 4 people matched against a corrupt architectural mogul. Eliza looked at her small team and felt a surge of confidence. "We are ready," she announced. "Tomorrow morning, we deliver the evidence to 3 separate agencies. It's all on physical hard drives, so Serafina has no way to make it disappear." The private investigator asked about Henderson Croft, the board chairman and Julian's staunchest defender. "Julian is already singing to the DA," Eleanor said. "He is offering them, the chairman, to try and salvage what is left of his own life." Her father, Robert, added that his old colleagues at the Attorney General's office were looking into the city inspectors who had protected Julian for so long. His network of protection is gone. A year ago, Eleanor was just an architectural historian, thrilled to be expecting her first child. Now she had endured an unimaginable loss, but in the process, she'd discovered a core of steel she never knew she had. She had forged new alliances from the wreckage and found a purpose for her sorrow. "Tomorrow," Eleanor said, her voice as hard as granite, "we bring his entire real estate empire crashing down." They all nodded in agreement. They were prepared. Eleanor selected a stark, glass-enclosed meeting room for the final showdown. Julian arrived radiating a chilling self-assurance, like a predator who believed the hunt was successfully concluded. "I must admit, I was surprised you reached out," Julian said, a dismissive smirk on his face. "I figured you were coming to terms with the new arrangement." Eleanor ignored the condescending remark. "In fact," she stated calmly, "I am here to present you with an alternative." Julian chuckled. "An alternative? You have no leverage. Your father is a retired prosecutor with no influence, and your allies are non-existent." Eleanor slid an iPad across the polished steel table. "The Adler Tower," she said quietly. "The shell company registered in Miami." Julian's smirk began to fade. "Lakeshore Holdings, the holding corporation in Delaware." The smirk vanished entirely. "I have it all," Eleanor stated, her voice like ice. "I located Simon Petrov, the accountant who kept the original ledgers." Julian scrambled to regain his composure, insisting that old paperwork was irrelevant. "You're wrong," Eleanor countered. "He retained the original signed permits and the unredacted zoning applications, evidence that cannot be digitally erased." Julian's face turned a pale, sickly gray. "You're bluffing." Eleanor simply raised her phone, showing Julian the news notifications. The district attorney had just unsealed the indictment. Then another notification from the FBI, followed by one from the city inspector general. "As we speak," Eleanor clarified, "prosecutors in 3 separate offices are announcing charges against you: racketeering, mail fraud, and bribery. In a few hours, the Illinois Commerce Commission will file their own civil suit. Your influential friends can't save you now." Julian's hands started to tremble. "And there is one more thing," Eleanor added, leaning forward. "Your chief financial officer has already cut a deal. He is exchanging your secrets for immunity. He learned from the best, didn't he? Prioritize self-preservation above all." Julian's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. "I will ruin you," he seethed. Eleanor stood up and placed the key to their Gold Coast penthouse on the table. "You destroyed our future. Your ambition cost me our son. You burned my life to the ground. She leaned in close to his face. But you overlooked one crucial fact. I spent my career as a historian, and I never, ever failed to uncover every last detail. Eleanor turned and walked out of the room without looking back, leaving Julian to confront the ruins of his life. 24 hours later, Julian Croft was taken into custody at a private terminal at Midway Airport as he attempted to flee the United States. The news broadcast showed him being led away in handcuffs, his image as a visionary developer utterly destroyed for the world to see. From the library of her father's brownstone, Eleanor watched the broadcast, flanked by her small group of supporters. Robert looked healthier every day from his wingback chair, while the investigator finally seemed at ease, standing by the window. On the couch, Simon wept without a sound as the man who had ruined his career was at last brought to justice. Simon whispered, "It is finally over." Her father corrected him gently. "Not quite. The board of directors still needs to answer for their part." 2 weeks later, the air in the courtroom was thick with tension as Julian Croft awaited his sentence. Eleanor sat in the first row, her face a mask of neutrality as the judge recounted the charges. 15 years for racketeering and conspiracy. As the bailiffs led a broken man in an orange jumpsuit away, every trace of his notorious confidence was gone. Eleanor's gaze met his. She gave no smile, no sign of triumph, only a quiet resolve that he could not withstand. He would have 15 years to contemplate how his child died, while he was securing a business deal. That was the justice she sought. After Julian's conviction, Robert began his own mission. His first visit was to Henderson Croft's sprawling suburban estate. The former chairman looked defeated when he answered the door, his professional standing having completely collapsed following Eleanor's civil suit. He had been ousted from every corporate and non-profit board. "Robert," he said, his voice thin and reedy, "we have nothing to talk about." "I believe we do," Robert replied, stepping past him into the foyer. "You were aware of his criminal activities. You dismissed Simon Petrov's warnings. A chairman's role is to place trust in his CEO," Henderson retorted. "A fiduciary's obligation is to safeguard the company. You failed." Robert tossed a folder onto a nearby table. "This op-ed is being published in the Tribune tomorrow. It meticulously details the board's complicity in covering up Julian's crimes." Henderson went white. "You wouldn't." "It is already filed," he said. "I have also arranged for Crane's business to publish an in-depth case study on boards that facilitate executive corruption. Your name is featured prominently." He looked at the man with utter contempt. "You taught Julian that integrity was for other people. Now you'll discover that the truth isn't optional." He left Henderson, standing amidst the wreckage of his reputation. Henderson put his house on the market within a month and disappeared from public life. His next visit was to Julian. Robert used some old contacts to set up a meeting at the federal penitentiary. Across a sterile table, he confronted the shell of the man his son-in-law had become. "If you came here for a lecture," Julian started, his voice barely a whisper. "Let me be absolutely clear," Robert cut in, his tone like ice. Eleanor's last line of defense was a whimper. "I did not realize the deal was so fragile." Robert leaned in. Her blood pressure was critical. "She was asking for you, while the doctors tried to save her, pleading for the baby to make it. I didn't know she was at the hospital," Julian sobbed. "You didn't answer your phone." "That is far worse," Robert shot back. "You saw the urgent alerts from her obstetrician. You knew it was a life-or-death situation, but you were at a celebratory dinner with your new partner from Dubai." A ragged, horrified gasp finally tore from Julian's throat. "Your development company, your investment portfolio, your empire. It is all ash now. You traded your life for 15 years behind bars." Robert rose to leave. But the one thing you can never escape is this. For the rest of your life, you will see her fighting to survive. You will hear the phone you chose to ignore, and you will know that you valued a real estate merger more than your own child. He walked toward the door as Julian's broken sobs echoed in the cavernous, empty room. "Now you carry that," Robert said, never looking back. His next stop was the federal prison up north, where Catherine Sterling was just starting a sentence of 25 years to life, with no chance of parole. She attempted to project an air of command in her stiff prison-issued uniform, a pathetic imitation of her former influence. "You can't possibly think you've won," she sneered. "I have the truth. You have lost everything," Robert replied, pushing a tablet across the table. "Every investor who admired you, every city official who was in your pocket, they all know exactly what you did. Every contingency plan you ever devised has been dismantled." "There has to be another way," she whispered, her final shred of defiance crumbling. "There isn't," Robert said bluntly. "You targeted my family because you saw an academic's daughter, an easy mark. That was a fatal error in judgment." He leaned closer, his voice sinking to a low, chilling whisper. "I built my career in a world that taught me how to tear down criminal enterprises from the inside." He turned and walked away, leaving her to the grim reality that awaited her. "Enjoy the next 2.5 decades. I will make it my personal mission to ensure they are as empty as you made my daughter's future." He left her with the crushing weight of a life that held no hope, only consequences. 1 month later, Eleanor sat in a serene clinic overlooking Lake Michigan, listening to the words that completely upended her world. "Congratulations," the doctor said, her smile warm and sincere. "You're approximately 3 months pregnant." Eleanor's hand instinctively went to her stomach as waves of pure, unadulterated shock rolled over her. 3 months. That meant it was from before her entire life was ripped to shreds. Before the zoning fraud was exposed, yes, the doctor confirmed, softly. You conceived before any of that became public. A new life had been quietly growing inside her, through all the ruin and grief. The timing was certain. It was from the last night she and Julian had spent together before she had found the hidden ledger. This baby was the sibling of the son she had lost, a delicate, unbelievable link to Thomas. The doctor asked gently, "Are you all right? I understand this is an incredible amount to take in." Eleanor made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I am. It is just, I never thought this could happen." "Given the recent trauma," the doctor started, "if you feel you need to consider your options." "No," Eleanor said, her voice suddenly resolute with a fierce, absolute certainty. "I want this child more than anything." The doctor's smile was filled with warmth and understanding. "In that case, we will give you the absolute best care." She drove straight to her father's Victorian house in Lincoln Park, her thoughts a storm of emotions. Robert was on his back porch, tending his garden, looking more content than he had in a very long time. He saw the look on her face and immediately set down his watering pot. "What is it?" he asked, his voice filled with worry. After she shared the news, a deep, peaceful silence fell between them. Then, his weary face broke into a smile of such tenderness, it was something she hadn't seen in years. "A new chapter," he whispered, holding her in a firm, reassuring hug. "Clara, after the hell you've been through, this is nothing short of a blessing." She rested her head against his chest. "I'm going to call her Grace," Clara said softly, "because that's what Leo's memory has given me." 3 months on, she stood at the groundbreaking ceremony for the Leo Initiative, an urban design advocacy group funded by the assets seized from Arthur and Isabella. Architectural models showcased vibrant community gardens and educational spaces where a condemned high-rise once loomed. A memorial fountain for her son was the centerpiece of the design. Clara rested a hand on her baby bump as she gazed at his name carved into the granite. David stood beside her, walking with a cane, but with a newfound fire in his eyes. Maya, her former protege, was there, finally out from under Arthur's thumb. Even Mr. Chen, the structural engineer whose testimony had exposed the deadly cost-cutting, had come in from Seattle. They were a handful of people, bound together by loss, and a fight for what was right. "I'm calling you Grace, because your brother was the foundation you build on when everything else has crumbled," she whispered, looking at the architectural plans. "He would be so immensely proud of you," David said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You never backed down." "I couldn't. I made a promise to him." Maya gave her shoulders a supportive squeeze. "And now you get a clean slate." Clara nodded. "Yes, but it's different. Before, I was designing a monument to one man's greed." "This time," she said, glancing at her small, dedicated team, "I'm doing this for me, for my son, and for the daughter I'm about to meet." Long after the others had left, Clara sat on a park bench across the street, watching the initial clearing of the site. She was alone with her thoughts, which, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, were quiet. She thought back over the last year, on all she had been forced to let go of, and everything she had managed to find. People say time heals everything, but she knew that wasn't true. Time simply dulls the pain. Healing is a choice you have to make every morning when you wake up. She got to her feet, placing a hand over her stomach. "I lost my son," she said, into the calm evening air. "I lost my architectural firm. I lost who I was in a world of ambition that I never wanted. But from that wreckage, I found the person I was always meant to be. My mentor taught me that justice isn't about revenge. It's about making sure those who break the world can't ever do it again." She looked over at the project billboard. Arthur would be in prison for at least 25 years. Isabella was disbarred and facing her own charges. Their capacity for destruction was over, but Clara's new life was just beginning. "This time," she said to the city lights, "I'm building this on my own terms." As she turned to walk away, she whispered one last time, "I love you, Leo." A light on a distant crane blinked, a single point of red against the Chicago skyline. Clara smiled, held her belly, and walked toward what was next. 4 months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Grace Clara Adler was born. She was perfect, with her mother's curious, gentle eyes. In the delivery room, Clara held her daughter close, while David shed quiet tears of happiness, and Maya created a new digital photo album. "Hello world, Grace," Clara whispered. "Your big brother is watching over you." As the infant snuggled against her, Clara felt a deep, profound sense of peace settle over her for the very first time. 1 year later, she stood at the entrance of the Leo Initiative. It was no longer a muddy lot, but a thriving center for ethical architecture and design. It was a place of creativity, born from an unthinkable tragedy. The initiative had already provided scholarships to over 50 students in its first year. Something truly beautiful had grown from something so ugly. Clara held Grace on her hip, pointing to the open-air studios and the young designers collaborating at their drafting tables. "That fountain right there," Clara said softly, "that's for your big brother. He had the most amazing imagination." Grace cooed and pointed at a group of students presenting a scale model of a new park. Clara didn't think of Arthur or Isabella in their cells, but of David, happily advising the students, and of Leo, remembering his endless creativity and his giant heart. "You're safe here, my sweet girl," she whispered. "You are part of something good, something that is meant to last." At that moment, A nervous young woman walked up to her. "Are you Clara Adler? My daughter just received her first scholarship from your initiative. And I don't have the words to thank you." Clara gave her a kind smile. "Come on in," she said. "Let me tell you about a very special little boy who showed me that creating something with purpose will always be stronger than tearing something down." As she led the woman inside, Clara finally understood. The grief doesn't ever disappear, but it can be reshaped. Your pain can become your purpose, and the love you have never, ever dies. It just finds a different way to grow. If this story touched you, if Clara's journey inspired you, please click the like button and share this with someone who needs to see it. Leave a comment below and tell me what you would have done in Clara's situation. And if you're new to our channel, please subscribe to our family so you'll never miss a story of strength, justice, and the incredible power of a mother's love. Your support is what allows us to keep going.